Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Outstanding Authors at Google presentation. The main thing that I can say to preface today's talk is that I love the 80s. Born there, love the movies. It's just a great time to be around, and it ushered in the technological and cultural revolution that, to a certain extent, continues to this day. In this light, we're very pleased to welcome David Sirota to our Mountain View office today. It's actually a return appearance for him. He made another talk at our Boulder headquarters as well. David is an author, commentator, and radio host, and his books have been influential and wide-reaching, ranging from subjects such as his book Hostile Takeover to his penultimate one called The Uprising. He'll be speaking to us today about his latest book, which is called Back to Our Future: How the 1980s Explained the World We Live in Now, Our Culture, Our Politics, Our Everything. Using the backdrop of 5 movies, he paints a picture of our modern political and economic scene. The DeLorean is still here, and David is here to tell us what it means. After the conclusion of his presentation, we'll have time for some questions and answers using the Q&A mic. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming David to Google. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Plug this in. Yeah, there are a lot of cords up here. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming, and thanks for having me here. So I have an audiovisual presentation which I'll go through, and just to let you know, there's going to be some trivia questions in here, and I'll give you the trivia answers at the end. They're sort of interspersed. I wish I had prizes to give out, but I don't. So I apologize. And just for some background on me, I am a big child of the 80s. I'm 35 years old, which means that I was, I guess, in 6th grade in 1988. And a lot of the premise of this presentation and the premise of my book is that we don't appreciate as much how much cultural products impact children in particular, cultural products that you'll see in this presentation that are not necessarily critically acclaimed, but do have a huge impact on kids, especially, I would argue, at that age, somewhere between, 2nd grade and 9th grade, but obviously throughout childhood. So that's basically the premise of the book. So I start out in the book, and I'm going to take you through basically 3 of the chapters, or the themes in the book's chapters. And so just to start out, to give you some background about why I wrote this book, is because clearly the 1980s are back right now, culturally. And here are some examples, some analogs to how the 1980s are back. So we've got Top Gun being remade, you have the Rambo remakes, Wall Street was remade, Tron was remade, the ATeam was remade, G.I. Joe, Hulk Hogan's now a reality TV star, the Lakers and the Celtics were playing in the championship, the Lakers and the Celtics were playing in the championship. Apple, which was a huge company in the 1980s, sort of went out a little bit. Between now, now it's back in a big way. And what I argue in the book is that the 1980s aren't just back in an entertainment way. The 1980s, what they taught us in the entertainment of the 1980s, is actually back in the real world, or there are analogs to what the entertainment archetypes were in the 1980s to actual real-world figures. So the first obvious one is, this is a picture of Maverick from Top Gun, and we had a president who was basically dressing up like Maverick for a very serious set of issues, the Iraq War. We have Rambo 3, took place in Afghanistan. Obviously, we're still fighting a war in Afghanistan. Wall Street, Greed is Good, Gordon Gekko. These kind of figures become very, very real-world figures. That's a picture of Bernie Madoff. The whole idea of master control, one giant computer company taking over the world. Luckily, my presentation had this guy, not Google, but you get the point. The ATeam, and we're going to go into this a little bit more in specific. The ATeam, this idea of mercenaries who solve problems. This has a very real-world application in how we've privatized the way we deal with national security. And then, of course, stateless terrorism. Cobra Commander, the faceless, stateless terrorist, as a fictional archetype, became and turns into Osama bin Laden. And not to say, very, very quickly, not to say that all of these examples are designed to be, in their own minds, connected to 80s entertainment archetypes. But it is to say that some of them are, and it is to say that the others that aren't, the way they are portrayed, the language with which we talk about these figures in our real world, are oftentimes talked about in the language of 1980s, and specifically 1980s entertainment. So, why was the 1980s so powerful? Why is it back? Now, let me just stipulate and say, there's kind of a trend where everything that's old becomes new again. So, yes, there's nostalgia. Yes, there's retreading old brands. Yes, Hollywood directors and screenwriters, it's easier to write, you know, the sequel to the sequel to the sequel than to actually write something new. But I also would argue that the 1980s, there were some pretty unique things about the 1980s that have made it stick around for as long as it's stuck around for. And the basic thesis of my book is that in many ways we are still living in the 1980s, that there were distinct eras before the 1980s and that we're still essentially living in the era of the 1980s. And I think the reason is, there's a couple of reasons I think the 1980s stuck around. First of all, the 1980s was the first decade that most people had a TV, a VCR, and cable. It was the first decade where there was that much media saturation, and especially one-way media, broadcast media, which is perfectly calibrated to propagandize as opposed to two-way media. The second thing that happened in the 1980s was integration, which is the idea that as we became more media saturated, more of the messages were integrated around each other in a self-reinforcing way. And as an example, you know, the rise of synergy, right? And synergy is the marketing technique, which I'm sure a lot of you know about, which is basically cross-marketing a brand across different products that in some cases have nothing to do with the product. I mean, there's an E.T. Happy Meal. I mean, what does a McDonald's Happy Meal have to do with E.T.? What does Mr. T have to do with a cereal? So this was really the golden age of integration and synergy in the 1980s. And then, of course, there was consolidation. And that word should be consolidation on there. But consolidation. By the mid-1980s, mergers meant 50 companies controlled most newspapers, magazines, TV stations, and movie studios. And so this allowed synergized marketing to happen in a way that was repetitious, that we had never experienced before in our culture. That, yeah, there was TV, and yeah, there was radio, and there was newspapers, but with more independent ownership before the 1980s, it wasn't necessarily that the same messages, the same brands, the same political ideologies were so rapidly and repetitiously marketed. And, you know, I say that this kind of created and let me turn the music up here. You know, I need the music to be up, but I have the Phil Collins thing playing, but it really did create kind of a land of confusion, I think, for a lot of people. And confusion, by which I mean, it encouraged, I think, children and adults, people who were becoming culturalized in the 1980s, to kind of lose the idea of where you should get the stories about your world, how to see your world. And this is just a quote from the Boston Globe based on some sociological research, and it says, TV and movie characters can shape how we look at real-world events. Fiction, in fact, and again, this is a story about sociological research, fiction shapes our perception of the world even more than reality. And one of the main reasons I think that happened in the 1980s was because a lot of the entertainment products of the 1980s were actually drawing on real-world events. And here's just a couple of examples. This is a quote that I found in my research from a maker of a video game maker who said, coin-op designers take anything remotely in the news and make it into a video game. Here's a couple of examples, right? This is Operation Wolf, Contra, Guerrilla. This was coming out at the time that there really were guerrilla wars. There really was a situation with the Contras. Now, granted, Contra wasn't necessarily about that, but the point of this is to say that one of the reasons the 1980s entertainment products continue to have traction in our culture and continue, as I argue, to shape the way we think about real-world issues is because the entertainment products themselves were shaped in the 1980s around real-world issues. I mean, if you were a kid playing Contra, you knew up, up, down, down, A, B, back, right, to get all the free, the free men. But what were you really being taught? You were being taught that, you know, to be a hero is to go and mow down people and to be, you know, to mow down the Contras. All right. So the first chapter of my book is about how the 1980s redefined and created the 50s and the 60s. Now, you'll notice I use the numbers 1980s there, and I use the 50s and the 60s, I spelled them out. And in the book, I've got a little TM next to them to suggest that the 50s and the 60s, quote unquote, are really brands. We're not really talking about the actual 1960s, 1960 to 1969 or 1950 to 1959. Typically, when we're talking about the 50s and 60s, we're actually talking about a 1980s version of the 50s and 60s. And I use as examples to explain how this happened Michael J. Fox playing two separate roles. I mean, on the left, you have him from Back to the Future, going back into the 1950s. On the right, you have him in the 1980s, the kind of archetype of the aspiring yuppie. And I'm going to explain how that kind of embodies how the 1980s re-remembered the 1950s and 1960s. So we'll start with the 1950s. So this is the key scene, the setup for what happens in Back to the Future.
Oh my God. They found me. I don't know how, but they found me.
Run for it, Marty!
Who? Who do you think?
The Libyans!
Look at my left! Holy shit!
That's like the most ethnically, racially offensive archetype ever. And I have a whole chapter in the book about that. But where does Marty McFly, a teenager in the 1980s, flee to? All right, he's being hunted by bazooka-wielding Libyan terrorists in his suburban town, right? This is the ultimate fear of like every suburbanite, right? My mom, oh my God, the Libyans are coming to kill us, right? So where, and again, I have a whole chapter on how this is like so wildly racist and everything, but where does he flee? Where does this teenager flee? Where do, when parents bring their kids to watch this movie, where do they are so relieved that their child or that Marty McFly flees into? Right, so he flees into the 1950s, this safe place where the biggest threat to humanity is Biff and a bald vice principal who calls him slacker, right? This is like the idea of the 1950s as this great time where there was, you know, everybody was unified, everything was safe, America was on the way up. Written out of the story, of course, is the fact that it was basically America was an apartheid state in the 1950s. There was all sorts of bigotry. That's written out of the story. And the 1980s really created this, not just through Back to the Future, but through all sorts of other products. I mean, that's Dirty Dancing. You had it in music. You had it again, those are music examples. Other movies, that's The Outsiders, Billy Joel songs, Hoosiers, Superman. If you watch Superman and think about, you know, this is a character from the 1950s. So the 1980s was really, really big on saying that the 1950s is a time that we should all want to go back to. And of course, the ultimate avatar of this was Ronald Reagan, a guy who, that was his whole career up until that point and throughout the 1980s. I mean, Ronald Reagan first became a famous political figure as the governor of California, who was ripping on the hippies at Berkeley. And so the flip side of this becomes, so that's the 1950s, how the 1980s, and I go into all in the book about how the 1980s built up the 50s, and all at the same time, it was demonizing the 1960s. Here's a clip. Here's the beginning of one of the top-rated shows in the 1980s, Family Ties, and watch it very carefully. So it's kind of cartoonish images of the 60s, of the parents as hippies. And this show was set up, interestingly enough, was set up to tell the story of the parents. But they showed it to test groups, to focus groups, and people liked Alex, the kind of aspiring yuppie, and how he was making fun of his parents' hippiness. They liked that a lot more, so ultimately the show was actually redeveloped around Alex and around the idea of basically making fun of the 60s. Now, here's an example of what I'm talking about. Oh, and I'm screwing up my order here, but these are some other examples of the 1980s making fun of the 1960s. Now listen to this.
Is this a permanent addition? Because if it is, I'm getting out my bombs or people to throw pillows.
The banner's a surprise from Matt. We had this hanging in our dorm room at Berkeley.
It's a little outdated, isn't it?
Well, maybe the slogans are different now, but the concept is the same.
No, I meant the concept.
Alex, don't you ever worry about the fact that there are enough bombs in the world to destroy every living creature and wipe out life as we know it?
Hey, I got bigger things on my mind. Can I use the business section here, Mom? Thanks.
Maybe we can just tell Matt he's one of the neighbor children.
It's just so predictable, that's all. And every time one of these ex-hippies comes prancing in from yesteryear, we got to get out the love beats.
Okay, and so that's a good example of it, right? So the 1950s was this great time that we should all want to go back to, and the 1960s was this ridiculous time where none of the social progress happened. It was all just about crazy hippies smoking weed, ruining our country. Now, if this all sounds familiar, and here's a couple of other examples of how that was epitomized, and if you really want to watch, and I cite The Big Chill here, and I love The Big Chill, it's a great movie, but if you really, really want to see how this worked, that's the one movie you should watch. Really, The Big Chill is so unbelievable in what it's really saying about the 1960s. The whole story is about how they're forgiving themselves for abandoning who they were in the 1960s. Anyway, so here's just a couple of other examples, but you get the point. The 1950s was great, the 1960s was evil. This becomes a way that we see our politics. This becomes a way that we see our world. So you have all sorts of products that basically glorify the 1950s. And I should be clear. In the book, I define the 50s as basically the beginning of World War II until the JFK assassination. That is what we think of when we think of the 50s, the great time, the greatest generation. And that when we really think about the 60s, we're actually talking about after John F. Kennedy was killed all the way through much of the 1970s. That's what the brand has become. And in the 1980s and subsequently after the 1980s, this carries on in our politics. And here are just some examples of how we glorify the 50s, how we've made it into remembering the nostalgia of the 50s into a brand. And the 60s, all of the great political progress, the serious political products of the 60s, is basically written out of the story, and the 60s has been commodified into like Ben & Jerry's kind of hippie ice cream, 1969 Gap jeans, fish shows, Cheech and Chong, even Whole Foods tries to glom on to this brand of the 60s was just this sort of crunchy, happy, but not really serious decade. And all of the serious stuff out of the 60s gets written out of the story. Now, what I show in the book is that this then becomes, starting in the 80s, the way we see our politics. So let's just go through a couple of presidential campaigns to see how this works, right? So here's the 1988 race, right? You got George H.W. Bush, the ultimate aristocrat, running for president, right? Vice president, his dad was a senator, super wealthy. This guy is the walking avatar of American aristocracy versus a second generation I always forget how those terms work. First generation, his parents were immigrants. Michael Dukakis, was he first generation? He's first generation American, right? A working class guy. And this campaign gets turned into, no, George W. Bush is not an aristocrat. He's the hardworking guy from the 1950s. Go back and listen to his speech at the 1988 Republican Convention, how this ultra-aristocrat reimagines himself. He grew up in a shotgun house in the 1950s, and he's talking about how we need to go back to the Norman Rockwell America. And he turns Michael Dukakis, through the flag-burning issue, into this, a sort of a ridiculous 1960s guy, or a guy who can't get by the 1960s, kind of a cartoon. That's him in the tank, the famous picture. Okay, so then we get to 1992. George H.W. Bush, still this completely out-of-touch guy. Here he is, not knowing what a supermarket scanner is, right? And there's Bill Clinton, kind of, this is the ultimate 1950, the 50s idea. Remember, before the JFK assassination, just the good guy from the 1950s. This race then gets turned into, no, George H.W. Bush is not an aristocrat, is not the guy who doesn't know what a supermarket scanner is. He's the World War II hero. He's the hero of that brand of the 50s. And through the whole thing about draft dodging, he tries to turn Bill Clinton into that. Now, in fairness, that is Bill Clinton. But that's what he wanted us to remember about Bill Clinton. Then we get to 1996. All right, Bob Dole, the ultimate kind of Washington insider, has been a senator for 1,000 years. Bill Clinton is this moderate Democrat, right? Basically, many people think a very, very conservative Democrat. Bob Dole tries to turn himself into, I'm the 1950s, I want to build a bridge to the past, right? And he uses the idea that Bill Clinton is some huge 60s liberal to try to turn Bill Clinton into this, the second coming of George McGovern. Now again, in fairness, that is Bill Clinton. But that's what he wanted us to remember. And it continues, right? Here's George W. Bush, the kind of frat guy, versus Al Gore, who enlisted in the military, who went to Vietnam. And George W. Bush tries to turn it into, no, he was the guy serving his country loyally in that 50s, that era of the 50s, and that Al Gore, using this idea of Al Gore's environmentalism, tried to turn Al Gore into this, basically the parents from Family Ties, this 60s guy who just sort of can't get by, can't get beyond, is just sort of out of touch, kind of an unreconstructed hippie. And Al Gore, I think, as much as I like Al Gore, the whole earth tone thing did not help. All right, so here's some trivia. And we'll get to the answers, but I interspersed some trivia here, just to make it fun. What was the name of the song that Patrick Swayze performed on the Dirty Dancing soundtrack? Don't shout them out, I'll give you the answers at the end. I've Had the Time of My Life, She's Like the Wind, Baby in the Corner, or Hungry Eyes. All right. Second question. What famous actor played the corpse in The Big Chill? Christopher Reeve, Harrison Ford, Alec Baldwin, or Kevin Costner? What city is The Outsiders set in? Omaha, Tulsa, Amarillo, or Topeka? All right. So my book then moves on, after going through how this creation of the 50s and the 60s, on to the idea of how the 1980s really gave us our views of the individual and hyper-individualism. And the chapter and the section starts with a look at this. That is, of course, Michael Jordan, and that image basically becomes this iconic image of the single individual soaring over everything, and it gets it gets decontextualized even from the image, and it becomes kind of a silhouette. And just for some beginning context to understand why Michael Jordan is so important to this. Michael Jordan obviously became the biggest, most famous person really in the world. And I think you need to look at the rise of individualism and narcissism in our culture through the prism of Michael Jordan because he was such a powerful figure. And just here are some examples of how this guy became really larger than life. And this is a fellow basketball player, Larry Bird, saying, I think he's God disguised as Michael Jordan. Chinese kids listed Jordan and communist leader Zhou Enlai as the two greatest men in history. The Washington Post called him the most famous man on earth. Fellow NBA players referred to Jordan as, quote, Jesus in Nikes, right? So to understand, and Michael Jordan had probably, I don't think there's ever been a study done about it, but more money in terms of advertising him behind him than probably any presidential candidate. And probably all the presidential candidates combined during his career. So this was a heavily, obviously marketed guy. And I argue in the book that he was marketed not just as a great basketball player, but underneath that was his individual qualities. This was a guy who, if you were an NBA fan, I was a huge NBA fan, and I hated Michael Jordan's guts because I was into Charles Barkley because I grew up in Philadelphia, and I can't talk about Michael Jordan without getting angry because I hate him so much because he always beat the Sixers. But he was marketed in particular as a guy who pulled his entire team up. And if you remember the Bulls in the 1980s and into the 1990s, most of their team kind of sucked. I mean, we can debate Scottie Pippen, but basically the team sucked. And Michael Jordan really was a team unto himself. And I'm sorry if there's any Bulls fans here that I've offended, but it's a great credit to Michael Jordan. And basically, that idea even gets decontextualized from Michael Jordan himself. He becomes the individual, but that image right there becomes marketed everywhere. And the ethos behind it becomes marketed everywhere. And it becomes, I think, a cult of the individual in the 1980s. And here are just some examples of how individualism, the individual saving the world, the individual fixing all of our problems becomes kind of the major thing that is sold to us in our culture. That you don't need a team, you don't need to work together, the common good isn't important, you just got to get an individual or yourself, be an individual hero, and all of our problems will be solved. This is my, and this is my, sorry about that, I clicked the wrong button, but as an example of what this becomes, right, it becomes all those one-liner movies, and this is my favorite one-liner. Right? It's just like, you know, this is how to deal with the world. You get an individual who violates all the rules, blows people away, solves problems individually. Now, watch this ad.
Yo, Mars Blackman here with my main man, Michael Jordan. Yo, Mike, what makes you the best player in the universe? Is it the vicious stunts?
No, Mars.
Is it the haircut?
No, Mars.
Is it the shoes?
No, Mars.
Is it the extra long shorts?
No, Mars.
It's the shoes then, right?
Nah.
Is it the short socks?
No, Mars.
Money's gotta be the shoes.
All right, now there's a lot to think about in this ad.
I'm sure, Mars.
What about the shoes?
No, Mars.
Okay,
Money's
so
gotta be the shoes.
think about the two things that were said in that ad, and that was one of the most famous ads in the 1980s. One, it's Michael Jordan saying, no, it's not the shoes, it's just that I individually am God, right? I mean, that's the first message of that movie. And I guess in fairness, to give Nike some credit, there's some honesty there. It really wasn't the shoes. I put on some Nikes and I wasn't Michael Jordan. But secondly, what is the most interesting part, I think, of that ad is that it was saying that to worship an individual is a virtue. Mars Blackman is a guy who is a super fan, right? And I would argue that in the 1980s, that became the idea that you should and could and must worship individual deities and take your cues from them, exclusively from them, is what that ad really was all about. To be a super fan is to be good, is to be something that's celebrated, is to be Mars Blackman. And this, I think, transcends, obviously, sports. We get all sorts of these huge, iconic individual deities, for lack of a better term, in the 1980s. You get the rise of individual televangelists that people create all sorts of movements around. They look in a top-down way for what these deities say. You had the CEO becomes a deity unto him or herself in the 1980s. This was different than in the 1970s, 1960s, and before. The idea that the CEO singularly turns a whole company, and with Lee Iacocca was the whole economy around. Donald Trump, obviously, I don't know what well, in the 1980s he was a businessman, I don't know what you call him today, but he, again, becomes this guy, the singular guy who can save economies, who can make huge, vast sums of wealth. Obviously, Oprah Winfrey, talk radio hosts, Rush Limbaugh, Howard Stern. These are people who don't just have fans, they have, I think, in the truest sense of the word, followers. And the rise of the self-help industry starts in the 1980s. Now, this has obvious analogs to today, because that's what my book argues, that we're still living in the 1980s with a 1980s mindset. And it lives in our politics. How we see the president, for instance. Does the president work for us, or do we follow whatever the president says? In the 1980s, this starts becoming the unitary executive theory. Ronald Reagan saying anything the president does is in our national interest. And this becomes George W. Bush. God wants me to be president. Another answer from him, I'm the commander, I don't need to explain, maybe somebody needs to explain to me what they say when they say something, but I don't feel like I owe anybody an explanation. This idea that the president dictates to all of us where we go, what we do, who we are as a people. And this is not just coming from the president, because lots of people believe this, right? A lot of people today, out of this culture of the individual in the 1980s, see that whatever the president says, if the president's in my party, I'm not going to question it. And the attitude now, it's symbiotic. It comes from the president, and it's reflected back onto the president. And it's not just Republicans, right? President Obama, I'm a better speechwriter than my speechwriters. I know more about policies on any issue than my policy directors. And I'm going to think I'm a better political director than my political director. When a staffer later sent him an email message saying, you are more clutch than Michael Jordan, Obama replied, just give me the ball. I mean, this is straight out of the 80s, or at least referencing the 80s, referencing what we learned in the 1980s. All right, some more trivia. What film was Spike Lee's first feature film? She's Gotta Have It, Do the Right Thing, Malcolm X, or Colors? What's the name of Jack Burton's nemesis in Big Trouble in Little China? David Lopan, Egg Chen, Wang, or Mr. Fuji? What famed singer performs an ode to America right before Apollo Creed is killed by Ivan Drago? Aretha Franklin, Tony Bennett, James Brown, or Cher? Okay. So this ad comes out in 1988.
But when you talk about destruction, don't you know that you can count me out? You know it's gonna be alright. Alright. Alright.
All right, so this ad comes out in 1988, and what I've just told you before, or gone through, is this idea that there are these great individuals that have superpowers and who can save the world singularly. But on top of being taught that in the 1980s, I argue in the book that we were taught that ultimately we could all be the Michael Jordans. We could all be the superheroes. And I cite this ad as an example, again, just one example. But watch this ad, this part of the ad, slowed down to see what this ad is really saying. So that's a regular kid, just a nobody kid, who basically becomes Michael Jordan. And if you actually watch that ad in slow-mo over the course of the ad, that's what the ad is doing. It's interspersing the greats, the great heroes, with regular people playing sports. And this becomes, obviously, Nike's Just Do It campaign. And if you really think about what is Nike saying with its Just Do It campaign, it's saying all of us can be Michael Jordan if we just do it, whatever that actually means. And Nike marketed this and marketed this, and this becomes a bigger thing through all sorts of other echo chambers. And I played this, I gave away the punchline, but...
for lack of a better word, is good. And greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA.
Right, so just doing it, in some senses, means making as much money as possible regardless of the consequences. Just doing it means huge, huge sums of wealth. And this is echoed in all sorts of cultural products. This idea of getting wealthy is the way to just do it. And not just in movies, right? In all sorts of television shows. This is Dallas. There's Falcon Crest. Dynasty. I'm from Denver. It looks a little bigger now. And even to kids, right? Silver spoons. Just doing it means achieving enormous sums of wealth. The American dream goes from a middle-class dream, I want, 2.5 kids, a white picket fence, to, I want Rick Schroeder's life. Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, another example. Now, just to show you how this is all working in some social science data. Just do it, the individual. I can be a great success if I make a huge amount of wealth, don't think about my community, am only focused on me, me, me. This is from some data from the book Bowling Alone. The percentage of Americans in a local club or civic organization. 1985, 15% of Americans. By the mid-1990s, 8%. I mean, that's cutting in half, essentially, the number of Americans who engage in one of the hallmarks that we call, community civic life. This is a really shocking and disturbing one. Top goals of college freshmen. So, in 1980, 62% of college freshmen say that they wanted to be very well off financially. That was their top goal. 74% by the, 72% by the end of the 1980s. A huge jump. Now, what's really mind-blowing about this is to put it next to the other things that college freshmen were saying about what they wanted to achieve, what just doing it really meant. So you take that same graph, okay, so there's that line we just saw. Now the other line that they measure is college freshmen saying they want to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. Okay, so in 1980, at the beginning of the 1980s, just doing it is shared basically, the same goals, big goals of college freshmen, basically the same amount are saying or listing as a top goal being getting a meaningful philosophy of life with basically greed is good. And then you see that drop precipitously during the 1980s. So this is how this message, this is an example of how this message really got through to people, and to kids in particular. All right, another trivia question. Who hosted Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous? Robin Colcourt, Robin Leach, Robin Ventura, or Piers Morgan? Would you be surprised if it was Piers Morgan? Which real-life tycoon gave the speech that inspired Gordon Gekko's Greed is Good oration? Donald Trump, Ivan Boesky, Michael Milken, George Soros. What was the principal commodity being speculated on in trading places? Wheat, soybeans, pork bellies, or frozen concentrated orange juice? What was Montgomery Brewster's job before he inherited $30 million? Minor league baseball player, janitor, limousine driver, or bartender? All right, so the final section of my presentation is about how this all became. So we went from the great deities who have individual superpowers to we can all be the great deities who have individual superpowers. And all of this was being, in the 1980s, coming through at a time in the nation's political moment where we were being told the government is evil, right? Ronald Reagan's speech, you know, the 9 scariest words, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. And there needed to be a way in the 1980s to explain how the government still, even though it was supposedly evil, how it was doing certain things that it does indisputably well. And out of that need comes the idea of the rogue.
I am not a role model. I'm not paid to be a role model. I'm paid to wreak havoc on the basketball court. Parents should be role models. Just because I dunk a basketball doesn't mean I should raise your kids.
All right, so this was cited as, this is an ad that transcended advertising. I mean, there were editorials about it. It became I think the New York Times called it the first advertisement as social commentary. This had a huge impact, and this was right at the, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I define the 80s in our mind as the entire Reagan era, Reagan-Bush era. So into the early 1990s. This came out right in the very, very early 1990s, but it kind of was the culmination of the idea that we should love and trust and respect and venerate only the rogues, the people who go rogue against everything. This became an explanation for how the government still did things right, is that there were people inside the government who said, I'm not going to listen to the rules put on me inside the government, I'm going to go rogue. And we'll get into some examples of that. But let's just stay in the sports arena for a second. Nike was quoted, a Nike executive was quoted as saying they wanted to market, quote unquote, outlaws with morals. That's the ultimate ethos of the good rogue, right? And Nike started this. This is, you know, here are the examples of the icons that Nike marketed. Steve Prefontaine, John McEnroe, Charles Barkley, obviously, Bo Jackson, Andre Agassi, Deion Sanders. All of them came out of that rogue spirit. They were doing something, they were breaking barriers. They were breaking rules that were put on them. And this was sold to us by Nike, and it was also sold to us in all sorts of other entertainment products. So think about all of the major rogue characters of the 1980s. And I can go through all of these, but, you know, let me just get them all laid out here. You've got, you know, here you've got Magnum PI. You can't rely on the government to solve crimes. You got to hire a PI. You've got Highway to Heaven. This guy, he's an angel who comes down from heaven to solve the problems, to go rogue and solve the problems where society and the government refuse to solve them. Han Solo. Think about the guy's last name, Solo, right? A loner. He's going to go rogue to basically overthrow the empire. And all of these examples. I mean, this one's my favorite, actually. The Fall Guy, right? I mean, the Fall Guy was a bounty hunter who was a stuntman. And talk about selling to kids. He's on the cover. The bounty hunter, who was a stuntman, is on the cover of a children's magazine. So as just an example of how this was sold to children in many ways, directly to children. And it had real-world applications, right? The 1980s was the time when the guardian angels from New York City were making all sorts of headlines. The New York City police officers, they can't solve problems. We have to have a vigilante. And it became the era of the Bernie Getz mythology, right? Bernie Getz, if you don't know who Bernie Getz was, he was the guy who made the argument in court that he shot a couple of African-American, I think they were teenagers, in a subway hall because he was afraid that they were going to rob him, and he was going rogue essentially to protect New York, and more New Yorkers need to go rogue to reestablish safety in New York City. Now talk about children's programs selling this.
Knight Rider, a shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist.
Listen to what the story of Knight Rider is.
Michael Knight, a young loner on a crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.
All right, now just think about what this show is saying to children, right? You can't rely on your government, you can't rely on your police force, but a right-wing foundation called the Foundation for Law and Government, FLAG, has hired Michael Knight, a young loner, to save you if you can find him, right? And he, not the government, not your community, he will champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, and the powerless, right? And this idea is not just in Knight Rider.
Just a good old boy, never meaning no harm. Beats all you never saw, been in trouble with the law since the day they was born.
All right, so what are they in trouble with the law for? They're in trouble with the law because they're trying to stop bad things in society. So it takes the Michael Knight idea, the Dukes of Hazzard did, and it doubles down on it and says that the people who are trying to help you are actually, they're outlaws for trying to help you. They're being chased by the police because they are trying to solve problems. The Dukes of Hazzard, obvious rogue archetypes, again, sold to kids. And this then, of course, is the ultimate example, my favorite example of all, my favorite part of the book to write, which is about. So let's take a look at the A-Team. And before we take a look in the A-Team, this is the last part of the presentation here, because I've been criticized for this, and some reviewers have said, well, you know, Sirota focuses on cultural products that weren't really critically acclaimed in the 1980s. They didn't really have much of an impact. Just as one example, the A-Team was the highest rated program among children ages 2 through 11. The highest rated program among preteens. So it's true, a lot of these cultural products may not have been reviewed very well, but they had huge audiences among people who were first developing the way they look at their at life. And so take a look at what the A-Team is saying.
In 1972, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from a maximum security stockade to the Los Angeles underground. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team.
All right, let's break this down a little bit, right? Because remember, the biggest show among kids ages 2 to 11. What is it really saying? What's the story of the A-Team? And kids saw that every single time that the show came on, that introduction. So let's break down what is really being said here. All right, so the A-Team is wrongly accused by the evil government. And the real story is, if you watch the first episodes of the A-Team, classified, they were ordered secretly by their government to rob the Bank of Hanoi to end the Vietnam War. Now, I'm not really sure how robbing the Bank of Hanoi would have actually ended the Vietnam War. And when their commanding officer is killed, the government denies all responsibility and says it's just the A-Team was trying to get rich. So the A-Team goes to jail. So the government is evil, sending our good heroes to jail. Okay, so the government is so utterly incompetent that what else would you do but promptly escape from a maximum security prison? I mean, it's just they just promptly escaped. It's just that easy. And after prompt escape, where else would you go than the thriving, lawless Los Angeles underground?
Today, still wanted by the government, they survived soldiers of fortune.
All right, now this is where it really gets ridiculous. So a government that can't maintain a maximum security prison or shut down a geographically confined underground obviously can't catch these guys. And the A-Team is surviving, solving problems that the government refuses to solve or cannot solve. Now, what are some of those problems that the... Hold on. One more clip. All right, so the A-Team, no one else can help. The government can't help. The military can't help. Here are some of the services that the A-Team goes and achieves. They conduct high-level military operations. They rescue a hijacked plane, for instance. They bring a rogue CIA unit to justice because the government can't do that. They protect small businesses from larger, bullying, often violent competitors. That includes two sisters who own a soda factory, an upstart LA cab company, and a small construction company. And rescuing the kidnapped. Now, here's the part that really is kind of mind-blowing. So, who can find the A-Team, right? Farmers, old people, church groups, an African country looking for help in finding their son. Rick James can find the A-Team. Hulk Hogan can find the A-Team. Boy George can find the A-Team. All right, so who can't find the A-Team? The combined resources of the national security state in the United States. And so what this says is that the government is incompetent, but the outsiders outside of the government are the only ones who can help. And it ultimately ends up portraying the government, this portrayal, like this, which is the scariest scene ever for a child. This ends up becoming the image of the government to kids. A faceless thing that is going to rip into your house and try to steal the innocent alien, aka E.T., who you are trying to protect, of course, from the government. And just watch this. I mean, this is a children's movie. This is the image of the government to kids. Right, like a Gestapo. I'm sure many of you remember watching this as kids. I mean, it was really horrifying. And you think about it, kind of Steven Spielberg. You're going to have like people in spacesuits go zombie busting into, like, why don't you just knock on the door of the house instead of going zombie into the house? And it's because this was the idea of the government. And here's the idea of how to solve problems.
Did you see it? What is it? We got it! What is it? Will there be any more of them?
Sir, what you had there was what we refer to as a focused, non-terminal repeating phantasm. Or
The only people who can solve problems are hired guns. For-profit hired guns.
For the entrapment, we're going to have to ask you for...
I mean, this guy, think about what he's saying here.
We are having a special this week on proton charging and storage of the beast, and that's only going to come to $1,000.
It's like extortion.
$5,000? I had no idea it'd be so much. I won't pay it. Well, that's all right. We can just put it right back in there. Thank you.
We certainly can, Dr. Venkman.
No!
Right, so he's threatening to throw basically this intergalactic terrorist back into the hotel unless the hotel pays the private contractor. Now, all of this is funny, and I'm a huge fan of the Ghostbusters and of E.T., but it's not a coincidence that a generation that was brought up on things like this is going to be a generation that asks relatively fewer questions about, hey, wait a minute, why is our government hiring private contractors at a higher cost than it would cost to do things through the government itself for things like the Iraq War, for things like homeland security? It's because when you bring up a generation, and these are just singular examples, but when you bring up a generation on this kind of thing, that generation learns this is the way the world works, when in fact this way that the world works is actually a radical vision, is actually a departure from the way the world had worked in our own country. The story of the Ghostbusters, literally the biggest city in the country is attacked by intergalactic terrorists. The military, the government, the police force, the political leadership can't deal with it. They have to hire the for-profit private company. That was one solution that the 80s posited to us. The other solution was to go rogue from within. And these are all the cultural products about the people in the government who go up against the bureaucracy in the government to try to solve problems. Half of the problem in all of these products is that the government won't let them do what they need to do to solve society's problems. And ultimately it becomes one-liners like this.
Diplomatic community.
It's just been revoked.
Right, so the idea is that, and this is of course Lethal Weapon 2, the archetype of doing right and protecting us means letting a lowly sergeant in a police force gun down an unarmed ambassador and unilaterally revoke that unarmed ambassador's diplomatic privileges as established by international law. He is the hero. The guy who just shot that unarmed man is the hero. And we get this, of course, the analog to this is our entire political debate. That when you hear George Bush talk about warrantless wiretapping, or Barack Obama talk about how he should have the authority to, without judge, jury, or trial, execute American citizens through assassination orders. What they are really tapping into is what we all learned in the 1980s, that that's the way to solve problems, is to go rogue and ignore the law and ignore civil institutions, because the law and civil institutions are the problem, not the solution. And out of the 1980s, this starts becoming political, as an example, through Oliver North. One thing that'll blow your mind, go read George Bush's speech on warrantless wiretapping, and then go read Oliver North's speech to the Senate committee about Iran-Contra. It's really, really creepy. All right, a couple last trivia questions, and I'll take some questions if you want to ask me some questions. What was Michael Knight's name before he was shot in the face and then nursed back to health by the Foundation for Law and Government? Michael Smith, Michael Keaton, Michael Long, Michael Kidd. What college did Charles Barkley and Bo Jackson both attend? University of Alabama, Bob Jones University, Auburn University, or Clemson University? What U.S. state is the fictional Hazard County supposed to be in? Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, or Georgia? And the final question, what famed game show did Cliff Clavin appear on and then lose? Tic-Tac-Toe, Press Your Luck, Jeopardy, or The Price is Right. Now we'll just go through the answers here. All right, question one, She's Like the Wind was the song that Patrick Swayze performed. Kevin Costner played the corpse in The Big Chill, although you never see his face. The Outsiders took place in Tulsa. Spike Lee's first film was She's Gotta Have It. David Lopan was the major nemesis in Big Trouble in Little China. James Brown sang that song before Apollo Creed was killed. Robin Leach was the host of Lifestyles and of the Rich and Famous. Ivan Boesky gave the Greed is Good speech. Frozen concentrated orange juice was the commodity being traded in trading places. Minor league baseball player was Montgomery Brewster's job. He was a pitcher for the Hackensack Bulls, I think. Michael Long was his name before he was Michael Knight. Auburn University. No, it wasn't Bob Jones University. Georgia is where Hazard County, the fictional Hazard County, was. And Cliff Clavin lost on Jeopardy. That's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Anybody? Oh, yeah.
Question, and probably is covering your book. What happened to the 90s if the 80s are still so powerful? Because you saw in the 90s the rise of several big things like environmentalism.
Mm-hmm.
You did see, like, in movies like Independence Day, which is like a quintessential 90s film, the hero of that movie is somebody from the government.
Mm-hmm.
So did the 90s just not count, or what happened?
Yeah, I mean, look, one thing with this, with my book and my argument is I think it's hard to, it's obviously hard to say any decade epitomized a finite amount of things, because there's basically an infinite amount of things that happen in a decade. What my book is concerned with is what you might call the quote-unquote mainstream cultural products and messages that were pumped out in the 1980s. And what I think is that there were actually products and messages in the 1980s that ran counter to all of this, as there were in the 1990s, as there were in 2000s. But what I would say is that we still live in a 1980s world in the sense that the way we look at the world and what majority culture and mainstream culture tells us and embeds in our culture and makes us assume, the stories that we tell ourselves are still very much the stories of the 1980s. Now, I want to be clear, I think that may be changing in some ways, right? And I think that's a good thing. But I think when you look at a culture that is so focused on the individual over the common good, when you look at a culture that is still having our political debates are still framed as, let's go back to the 50s, no, let's go, the 60s and the progress of the 60s were good, that's still the debate. And my book also goes into the whole idea of militarism and how the 1980s told us that the major way to solve problems is to use the military. I have a whole section on that. It's not that I'm saying that there were no 1990s. What I'm saying is that the things that you mentioned out of the 1990s, I don't think have yet become the new stories, the new dominant stories that we tell ourselves, and that direct our public policy, for instance, just yet.
So Spielberg and most of Hollywood are pretty much liberals in good standing, I would assume. And so where do these messages come from? Because they do seem to be contrary to a liberal worldview. Are they coming from the corporate control, or is this just reflecting what the audience wants to hear?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I get asked this question a lot. Are you saying, it's basically, are you saying that there's like some sort of conspiracy? And I'm not saying you're saying there's a conspiracy, but like, did all these people get into a room and say, all right, listen, we're going to sell America on the idea that the government is that spaceman busting into people's homes? And I don't think that's the way it worked. I did a lot of interviews with people who created some of these products, and overwhelmingly what they say is that, look, our job was to sell tickets. Our job was to get ratings. Our job was to fill seats at the movie theater. So when we sat down and came up with stories to create and tell people, we weren't saying, all right, listen, I'm going to sell this audience that doesn't believe this already on a new idea. It was, we need the quickest, shortest shorthand, storytelling shorthand to get people to watch our product, consume our product, buy tickets. And so, I interviewed, a good example is I interviewed the creator of Family Ties, who was a hippie in the 1960s. And I said, you made this show, and a lot of this show is like making fun of the hippies. And he's like, well, I was just trying to tell the story of how, my family and I had a son and how it kind of felt in our house. And he's like, I never really thought about the fact that we were really making fun of the hippies. And he said it, and he didn't say it like he's ignorant. It's just that it was never on their mind. It was that in the midst of the Reagan era, the backlash to the civil rights movement, the military buildup with the Soviets, it was, what's the quickest point between A, the audience, and B, the storyteller? And we're going to default basically to the lowest common denominator. And the lowest common denominator at that point was this set of stories. And the reason I ultimately wrote this book was not to just look back and say, hey, the 1980s is still today. It's to say, those stories, the rogue is the only one we can trust. We can't trust civic institutions, the individual over the common good, militarism, and I have a whole chapter, by the way, on the idea of that we've become a post-racial society. That comes out of the 80s. Those stories are radical departures from the stories we had been telling ourselves as a country. And that, I don't want to give too much away about the kind of conclusion of my book, but if we can acknowledge that they were radical departures, if we can acknowledge that they were manufactured stories, then it means we have the capacity to tell ourselves different stories. But that's going to require an awareness that the storylines here are not just kind of mystical, magical forces of nature. They are actually artificially constructed.
Why did the audience's preferences change?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I would say this. I would say that, people ask me a lot, well, did Ronald Reagan create the 1980s or did the 80s create Ronald Reagan? And I just think it's kind of there was a symbiotic relationship going on with the politics of the moment, that in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the end of the Vietnam War, and I have a whole section in my book about how the Vietnam War played into this, and the whole idea that we lost the Vietnam War because people opposed the Vietnam War. That was a huge thing that happened in the 1980s, the revisionist memory of what happened in the Vietnam War, that I think there was a perfect storm of people looking for answers to the tumult, perhaps, of the 60s and the 70s. And these stories provided crystal clear, very simple, and very, very ideological storylines that seemed to explain the world. Yes?
So I would like to understand, I guess the fact that you said that people, when they were born in the 80s, looked fondly on the 50s, and then again, we still tell the stories of the 80s today in a lot that we do. Kind of, how much is that of people in certain, obviously in the 50s having the baby boomers coming into age or coming of age and positions of power in order to be able to be the people who generated this content and made these decisions in the 80s. Subsequently, people who were born in the 80s and who are in those positions today obviously remember fondly on those stories, and how does it kind of perpetuate itself? And then this focus of going rogue being driven by having expansion in the American family in the 50s due to baby boomers and people trying to effectively maybe fight free of that family unit, and maybe now this culture of individuality forcing people to achieve at higher levels as individuals. So
okay, so two parts. I mean, no, they're both good questions. I mean, the first part is that I do think that the idealization of the 50s that happened in the 1980s, you're right, was naturally from storytellers who grew up in the 50s and remember their childhood. And in some ways, for most people, I mean, there are very traumatic, troubled childhood among some people, but for most people, you kind of naturally remember your childhood as this time of innocence because for you it was. And so a lot of Spielberg's products, even though they're not set in the 50s, you can sort of, that's kind of the perfect representation of that, is that this idea of innocence, childhood innocence. And so the 50s, among people who were children in the 80s, the people who were children in the 50s were looking at the 50s through the lens of their own childhood. A good example of this, by the way, is the movie Stand By Me. Right? Stand By Me is looking back at the 50s as a very innocent time, although there was obviously a lack of innocence there as well. But so I think that was a natural part of it. But I also think, and we can't negate that the most revered and iconic political figure of the moment was Ronald Reagan, who was originally famous as an actor in the 1950s, was a guy whose entire politics and a lot of his speeches were about having to go back to the 50s, and we have to stand up to the 60s. We have to, literally a war on the 1960s. Now, to your point about going rogue, some people have said about this book, they've said, well, the 60s was a time of individuality and individual expression and rebellion, going rogue against society. And I think there's something to that. And what I think some of the genius of the 1980s, especially in politics, was that conservatives and Republicans stole the rhetoric of and the zeitgeist of rebellion and turned it into, you don't need to rebel against society, you need to rebel against specifically the government. That the government, either through taxes or regulation or anything else, is trying to keep you down. And I think one of the, there's a story in the book about Jerry Rubin, the yippie, right? The protester in 1960s, one of the leaders of the student movement. And in the 1980s, he became kind of a corporate guy. And he was interviewed in the 1980s, and he was talking about, in the interview, and it's in the book, he was talking about how he realized that rebellion meant basically rebelling against the government, not really rebelling against the social mores of society. And whether, again, it's not a conspiracy. I don't think a bunch of people got in a room and said, we're gonna do this. But I think it's sort of metastasized into not let's rebel and have a revolution, a cultural revolution in society. It became let's rebel against the government.
I noticed in your presentation that Oprah was the only female. I was just curious, is this story, was it also towards women, or was there a totally different message?
In the book, or well, yeah. Well, there's two things about that. One is that I think in the 1980s that the cause of women's rights actually was a cause that was as successful or even more successful than any other, I guess you could call it, progressive cause in the 1980s. And so for purposes of my book was trying to raise what happened in the 1980s that continue today that hold us down and hold us back. And in the chapter that I have, the last chapter about the Cosby Show, I have an entire discussion about how we foisted upon us, maybe not foisted upon us, but the Cosby Show represented, and there was a big debate about it in the 1980s, about how whether the Cosby Show was saying that there is no racism anymore or there is. And as an example, the Cosby Show, some scholars argue that it substituted gender equity for a discussion of race, for a discussion of what was really going on in America at a time of institutional racism in the 1980s. And the Cosby Show really, I think, represented what was happening in the country in the 1980s for women. That it was actually I think the 1980s was economically a bad time for most people, despite all of that. Inequality got bigger, poverty rose, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of women's relative place in society, the 1980s, and I'm happy about this, was a time where women made real advances, and we're still not an equal society. So I guess what I would say is that a lot of militarism, the 1950s, the 1960s, the individual, it's kind of, that happened to us all. And so I guess I didn't single out women, and I didn't discriminate against women, and I'm not trying to make this a defense of my book. I guess I'm giving a long answer to a shorter question, which is just basically that I really think that women were one of the very few groups that managed to make, as a group, real progress at a very reactionary time. Yes?
So you mentioned a lot of different tropes that were coming out in popular media during the 80s, and I can think of times where widespread media would focus on at least one of those. So you talk about silver spoons, and I can think of Little Orphan Annie and things like it. Or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington has the guy going rogue inside the government. And those had a lot of similar followers. So you had these pockets in time of some of these things being popular among most of America, but not all of it together. I can also think of times where a lot of this was popular among a particular subculture. A lot of blaxploitation films had the hero going rogue in a community where you can't trust the government. So I'm wondering if these patterns that you're drawing for all of America during the 80s, if you could find pockets of those earlier or different.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely, and I'm glad you bring it up. None of this, I think I could say none of it, most of it is not exclusive to the 1980s, but I think its traction in the world is exclusive to the 1980s. By that I mean, yes, you always had people in society who were saying that, you know, William F. Buckley, Mr. Individual, Ayn Rand, you know, they were around, but they didn't, their ideas didn't become the embedded assumption in society until the 1980s. And my book is actually chock full of data to prove that point. And I have a lot of data in there, especially in the chapter, by the way, on individualism and narcissism and people's goals, about, okay, in 1980, this is what polls said. In 1990, this is what polls said. And polls have subsequently not gone back to their pre-80s levels. So I'll give you one example on a topic that we didn't talk about in this presentation, the one example that just is mind-blowing. In 1980, 50% of Americans said that they did not have confidence in the military and that they had questions about our military posture, how much we were spending on the defense budget. So a huge number of Americans saying, basically, we're not comfortable with us being such a militarist country. By 1990, 85% of Americans said they had full confidence in the military, and the military was the most revered and respected institution in the country, where that number has basically stayed. And you have to ask yourself, well, what intervened in between a time when the country was saying, hey, you know, maybe we got to rethink this whole invade everybody idea, to we're not going to question the military at all. The military is the central organizing institution in our country. And what I did in the book was say, you know, there was militarism in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. I tried to look at areas where the 80s had an impact and that the impact has remained and stayed. Yes?
But it sort of comes down about the military, I think is a good example. It comes down to specific examples. I mean, in 1980, that was just after the Vietnam War, where people sort of had some issue with the military. And then in 79, of course, was the hostage rescue fiasco. So of course, people were going to be way down on the military. And then, you know...
But just to give you some context on that, I do agree with you, but that number was not a spike. In other words, the number was not like up here and then it was like boom, right? It was a gradual decline and then a steep incline up to beyond where it had ever been before that, or at least before that since the end of World War II.
Sure, okay. But so my real question was more about, do you think this is cyclical, right? So is this, you know, the 1980s and then in you know, X number of years, we're going to go back to what the 60s were, the 50s, and then it'll sort of cycle through. I know that there's a whole theory on history.
Right, we keep repeating ourselves, or the same themes come up every 30 years. Look, I think that there is something cyclical about it, except for this point, which I worry about, which is that I cite a study in there by Temple University, which found that the 1980s was the first time in any mass way that the media began presenting our politics through the lens of generations and eras. That I know we think about, Generation X and Generation Y and the 80s, and there's the 50s and there's the 60s. Actually, Temple University did this big study looking at magazine covers and magazine copy through over 100 years, and that the 1980s was the first time where the media started defining very clearly the 60s generation, the 70s, the 80s. And what I would say is that was the first time, and if so much of the 1980s was a battle over previous eras, or to define previous eras, then if it is cyclical, so much of the 1980s was about previous eras that we haven't stepped forward into another era, so that what I fear is that it's all just going to be a derivative of the 80s, right? That the cycle, because there hasn't been a new set of storylines, is simply going to be more and more of the 1980s, even though we may not call it the 1980s. I mean, we're still talking about The Tea Party folks, I quote a bunch of Tea Party folks, they're still talking about the 50s. I mean, people who didn't live in the 50s. Like, the New York Times had this great quote from this guy. There, you know, he's like, we got to go back to the 50s. Life was better in the 50s. And they said, well, what were your memories of the 50s? He's like, well, I was born in 1964, you know? And so what I'm saying is that it's cyclical, but I don't think it's going to go back to what was before the 1980s until there are actually a new set of storylines that actually challenge the 1980s. I mean, we haven't yet had a president, and I lament this, I don't think, who has said, you know what, the common good is more important than the individual. I mean, that just hasn't been the way we talk about our world in this country. Yeah, it used to be the way we talked, right? In the 1940s, everybody's got to sacrifice for the World War II, and everyone's, you put out the, my grandmother always tell the story, whatever they got at the supermarket, if they got tin, they had to put it out on their doorstep because then it got picked up and melted down for the, for the munitions. Those are radical concepts, and nobody has even presented a counter to what intervened in the 80s. So what I'm saying is it's cyclical, but I don't think it's I think we're caught in kind of a on loop. So I just want to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions or you want me to sign a book, I'd be happy to. Thanks again.